Dr. Kabelo Sebolai was appointed as our Deputy Director in the Language Center, and specifically his appointment relates to language and communication development. But he's been here with us for almost 3 years now. Yes. And prior to this, he served at UCT as a research lead for language testing in the Center for Educational Testing and Assessment Placement. So this topic comes a long way, and it's also part of his research field. Thank you very much, Kabelo, for being here this afternoon, for introducing this topic, sharing some of your research with us, and we really look forward, colleagues, to an interactive opportunity afterwards to talk to each other and to talk with Kabelo on this important topic that you see on the screen. Thank you, Kabelo. Enjoy. We look forward to it.
Thanks. Okay, thank you everybody for attending this talk. So the topic of my talk is going to be validating the highest performance standard of a test of academic literacy for students from different home language backgrounds. And so you have technical things there like validating and then performance standard, but I believe this will become clearer as I continue with my presentation. So I'm going to start by giving you background to this topic, which is that Stellenbosch University is a former Afrikaans medium institution whose current language policy is multilingualism. And so the university intends to, through this language policy, to promote Afrikaans, English, and isiXhosa, because these are the three languages that are mostly spoken in the Western Cape. Now, although, especially in the Language Center, we make a lot of effort to promote the other two languages, English has become, it continues to be the most widely used of the three in the university. Now, Stellenbosch University, like other universities, is also concerned about what I will call the articulation gap here. I want to be careful not to use words like underpreparedness or, lack of readiness and so on. So the university is also concerned about what I will call the articulation gap among incoming students. And what I mean by that is that there is a mismatch between what students leave high school with and what they are expected to be able to do when they get to university. So there is that gap, and this is what the articulation gap means. Now, Stellenbosch University uses the national benchmark test to assess this gap, the extent of this gap. And the national benchmark tests have it's a battery of 3 tests. They assess mathematics, they assess quantitative literacy, they also assess academic literacy. Now, I come from a language teaching and testing background, and so my focus is on the academic literacy component of these tests. Now, my research question was, how valid is the highest performance standard set for the NBTAL, that is the National Benchmark Test in Academic Literacy, in classifying students from the 3 language backgrounds? And the 3 language backgrounds here, like I said, refer to students coming from English, Afrikaans, and isiXhosa backgrounds. Right, so I would like to talk briefly about validity because it is central to this presentation. Now, in testing, the word validity means it's a function of how well a test measures what it is intended to measure. And so traditionally, validity has been classified into 3. So we have construct validity, which means that as a test developer, you need to be able to defend the ability that you want to measure theoretically. So there has to be some kind of theory that underpins what you say the test assesses. So to the extent that you can do that as the owner of a test, it means the test has construct validity. And then content validity is another type of validity which relates to how test content reflects what a test taker will be expected to do in a real life situation, which in the literature on language testing we call the target language use domain. So a test of academic literacy like this one, for example, would have the academic context as the target language use domain. And then you also have criterion-related validity, which is the extent to which a test relates, so performance on one test relates to performance on another that assesses the same ability or a related ability. And criterion-related validity is of two types. There is concurrent validity and then predictive validity. So this presentation focuses on this last one, which is predictive, because universities are interested in knowing how pre-admission or pre-instruction assessment relates to academic performance in the end. Right, so that's the meaning of validity. Now, why this study? I did this study because the NBTAL is one of the components of the NBTs, which is compulsory for first-year students at Stellenbosch University. And medium to high stakes decisions are taken on the basis of performance on this test. So it is important for us to know whether it is valid or it is not, or to what extent it is valid. Now, for example, the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences use it for selection. So in other words, it informs decisions about admission, and so it is high stakes decision. You can stop people from entering the university on the basis of this test. And the law faculty as well, uses it for the same reason, but other faculties uses it for providing additional information for placement. So that is the law stakes. But again, it is important that we know that this test is valid because this decision is also important. Right. Now, what does this test focus on? I'm going to summarize. This is how Cliff and Yeld at UCT describe what this test focuses on. But the long and short of this is that it aims to assess students' ability to cope with the discourse, the language demands of university education in a very generic sense. And this is what this quotation means. And if you look at how this construct is broken down, you will see that the test does not focus on assessing language in the traditional sense. It assesses language as it will help students to perform at university. So for example, if you look at, sorry, can I use this? Just to mention a few. So for example, in this case, students are tested. So the test assesses students' ability to separate essential information from non-essential information. So we want students to be able to, for example, identify main ideas and supporting ideas when they read, and they should also be able to, do the same when they write, because they're expected to write all the time. Also, for example, the test assesses students' ability to negotiate meaning at word, sentence, paragraph, and whole text level. So really the aim is to, according to the developers of the test, is to assess students' ability to use co-text or the context to determine the meanings of words if they read and they don't understand them. So if you look at this in general, you will see that these are generically the kind of language abilities that one needs to have to be able to access, to have epistemological access, to access university education. Right, so the NBT, performance on the NBT test, and all of them, is categorized into three. So you have the basic level of performance, you have the intermediate level of performance, you have the proficient. Now, these students who fall in the basic band are those that the test performance reveals serious learning challenges. And typically these are students who would need to go to they need long-term support. So they would need to go, for example, to FET colleges for some time before they can come to university and then, perform well. And then, so that is the lowest performance level. Now the intermediate performance, so performance within the intermediate means that the challenges identified are such that it is predicted that academic progress will be adversely affected. And so this is the group of students who would need to take a one-year bridge program for them to get ready, assisted for higher education. Now the proficient band means that students who perform within this band are those that can go straight into mainstream program, and they're unlikely to experience any challenges. Again, this is performance standards that the NBT project people put in place, and I'm trying to explain what it means. Now, as you will realize as I continue, my interest is in the proficient band, because, I'll explain later. Let me not go there yet. Right, now this is where I'm going to explain why I chose to focus on the proficient band. As you can see, Stellenbosch University typically perform very well in this test. So the largest proportion of the students here are in the proficient band, and you have a very, very small proportion there. And if you go to other universities, I mean, the opposite is true. And this picture is very common for UC2 students as well. Now, I decided to focus on the proficient band because I was going to get the largest sample size here, so that the conclusions I can arrive at would actually be on the basis of the sample size. So, it was going to be difficult for me to, for example, to focus on the intermediate band because you don't have enough sample size for the students here. That's one reason. So, again, just to show a picture of how students at this university perform typically at faculty level on this particular test. So, as we can see, theology students and then students in education tend to have low median scores. And this is not just for 1 year. This is from 2012 to 2017. The picture looks the same, has looked the same over the years. Right, now, the methodology I used to do the study was to look at what I call sensitivity and specificity statistics. And I'm going to try and explain this, and it is important for us to understand what this means at this point, because when I explain the results, we will need to remember what this means. Right, so sensitivity involves the number of true positives. So the proportion of students above a cutoff point who pass their first year. So for example, in the NBT AL test, the cut score for proficient is 63%. So in other words, a student who gets 63% on the test is classified as being proficient by the test. And so this is a student that should, according to the developers of the test again, should go into academic education, mainstream programs, and then do well without any possible challenges. So what sensitivity means, the word sensitivity term answers the question, to what extent does this test classify a student as a proficient student and then they do well at the end of the first year? Does this make sense? Yeah. So if a test sensitivity is good, it means when it classifies a student as one that will do well, they actually do well. Right, and then specificity involves the number of true negatives. So the proportion of students below a cutoff point who fail their first year. So in the case of the NBT AL, for example, so to what extent do students who score below 63%, to what extent do they actually fail because the test actually means that they will struggle? Do we understand this? Okay, thanks. So please keep this in mind because we're gonna, right now the methodology, the sample size was 13,858 first year students enrolled in all faculties between 2013 and 2015 at Stellenbosch University. Now, the Afrikaans and English samples were considerably larger than the EC-COSA group because of the student demographics of the university. And so, in the case of this study, the predictor variable, like I said before, was the NBT AL proficient band. So I was interested in seeing how efficient or how valid this band is, this cut score is. And again, the reason was that you have the largest proportion of students in the proficient band, so there's a lot of students there that you can use for a study like this. Now, the outcome variable was an average of 50% score at the end of the first year. Now, I chose this variable because typically, well, I think that as far as I know, students pass a course when they get 50% average. So a student, for example, who takes 5 courses and they perform above 50% on average and they pass all of them, it means they have actually satisfied the proficient, as meant by the NBT this band. So I decided that I was going to look at how efficient the AL proficient band was in classifying students as those who will do, and then using 50% average as the cut score for saying they have actually done well, they have actually succeeded at the end of the first year. Right, now, I couldn't get this to be bigger, but I can try to read this for you. I'm sorry, this This is the output from the software. I couldn't tinker with this. I'm sorry about this. I was aware that it was going to be this small. But what happens here is that, so for the EC-COSA, once I have done the sensitivity and specificity analysis, so I found that there was 355 EC-COSA students in total. And again, this is from 2013 to 2015. And again, the reason why the sample size is so small is that the demographics of the university actually are like that. Now, so 355 students in total who were part of the sample. And then, this is the proficient band. Now, the total of students out of 355 that were classified as being proficient was 127. Now, if you look at, so my aim was to look at whether the proficient band is accurate when it says that students who score in that band would get 50% and above. So what I found was that 94 students in total were classified correctly as those that would score above 50%. Right? And then 33 of them scored below 50%, even though the test, I mean, the performance in the test meant that they would actually not get less than 50%. So in other words, while the proficient band, in the case of the EC-COSA students, was supposed to say that these students would get 50% and above, not all of them did that. So in other words, this number 33 is the extent of the error. So in other words, these students were misclassified because according to their performance on the test, they were supposed to score above 50%, but they did not. Okay, but again, if in the case of the EC-COSA students, you will see, I mean, I showed you that most of the students in general are in the proficient band, but you will see that in the case of the EC-COSA students, the majority of them were actually in the intermediate band, which is the lower and upper. So, it was not the case with them. And still, even some of them, so 93 of them who scored within the intermediate band were able to score above 50%, which means that they were not correctly classified. And then you have 33 of them again who were in the lower intermediate band who got 50% and above. So what I'm trying to show you here is that the test is not 100% accurate in classifying students as those who would get 50% and those who would get less. But this is normal. There's always error in measurement. The point is that we need to know the extent of the error because we have to take decisions on the basis of this performance. Right. I hope this makes sense so far. Okay. Now, let's look at the sensitivity. So we're interested in the proficient band. Now here we have 41.559% sensitivity for this group of students. So in other words, the test's ability to classify students correctly from the EC-COSA background as those that would get 50% and above was just 41.59%. And then the specificity value was 74.42. So in other words, the value for specificity in the case of the EC-COSA was higher than it was for sensitivity. So in other words, in the case of this group of students, the test was more efficient in classifying students as those that would not do well. Are we on the same page? Okay. Now, let's go on to this graph. So sensitivity and specificity analysis is always accompanied by this curve, which is called the receiver operating curve, so the ROC curve. Now, I'm going to tell you why this curve is important. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the area under that curve is an indication of the extent to which the test, not really the test, but the proficient band, because that is the variable, the predictor variable. It is an indication of the extent to which that performance level can actually separate students out as those that will get 49% below and 50% and above. So how good is it in terms of discriminating between the two groups of students, those who fail and those who pass? Now I'm going to go back to that graph again. So it is this area here. So the larger this area, the greater a test's ability to discriminate between two groups of students. Now, and the figure, a measure for this is this figure here. If you have it at 0.5 upwards, it is acceptable, but it becomes a concern if it gets lower than 0.5. So this area, so the larger the area here, the greater the test ability to discriminate between the two groups of students. Those who get 49% below, 50% and above. Now let's look at the, so just to read this for you again. So the area under the curve is denoted by the AOC and is used as a measure of the ability to discriminate between the distributions of the scores of the pass population and the F population. So larger values of AUC indicate a greater discrimination ability. Right, let's look at the Afrikaans group now. Again, this is not visible enough, but then the total number of students here was 6,917. Again, you can see that the sample size was larger here. So in this case, 3.672 students was the total of those that the test classified as being proficient. So from 6,917 in total, so 3.672 were classified as being proficient. Now if you look at this again, you have 2,990 students who were classified as being proficient, scoring between 50%, from 50% and above. But you still also have students who were classified as being proficient by the test, like 682 of them scoring below 50%, which means these students were actually misclassified by the test. And so the question is, what do we do about this? Because typically test users just get this information and then they decide without knowing that there is this kind of problems in testing. Right, so again, you have students in the intermediate band, like 2,083 and then 189 in this band, also scoring above 50%, but this is supposed to be the intermediate band, and so you would expect students here really to struggle unless there was some kind of assistance or support that was provided to them. Now let's look at the sensitivity statistics. So here for this group it is 56.79 sensitivity, so this is the extent to which the test was able to classify students as those that would do well and then they actually did well. And then specificity, it's not very different, it's 58.72. Again, or there's something I forgot to mention, sorry. Let me just quickly go back there. I forgot to mention to you the total ability of the test to classify students correctly. So in the case of the isiXhosa students, the ability of the test to classify students as those correctly, as those that would get 50% and above and 49% and below was 53.52. So this was like 54%. 54% of the time, the test was able to classify students as those that would do well and those that would not do well. And then if we go to the Afrikaans group, so sensitivity was 56.79, specificity 58.72, and then the correctly classified 57.25. Again, not very different for these two, from these two. Now let's look at the group of students from the sensitivity again. It is lower here, less than it was in the case of the isiXhosa students. So it means this area here was smaller for this group of students as compared to those for isiXhosa. But the reason really could be that the difference in sample sizes. Remember that for the isiXhosa students, we only had 127 students who fell in the proficient band. I'm just saying this is a possible limitation, but the type of software that we use take numbers into consideration, and in second language research, we don't have the luxury of large sample sizes, and so this is why we use software that take numbers into account. But again, so in the case of the Afrikaans group, you had a lower ROC value, which means that the test was able to discriminate better for isiXhosa students than it was able to do so for the Afrikaans group. Right, so for the English group, and this is very interesting, for the English group you had a total of 6,587. Again, some students were misclassified. For example, you have those who were in the intermediate band actually also scoring 50% and above. And then you also had those who were in the proficient band also scoring below 50%. And so, students were misclassified to a greater or lesser extent in each case. Now, if you look at right, so look at the sensitivity, specificity, and correctly classified figures. So sensitivity here for the English group was 79.36, and then specificity was 30.27. So it means in the case of the English group, the test was a better classifier. The proficient band was a better classifier of students who would do well than it was for those who would not do well. And then the total correctly classified value is 66.16, which is very different from those for isiXhosa and for the Afrikaans group. Now this is very interesting because this is an English test, and what does it mean? Does it mean that students who come from an English-speaking background are advantaged when it comes to the test? Now I have to make it very clear that there is a difference between when you get students coming from an English background, they are very likely to do better than those who don't in the test. But performing well in the test should not mean that the test predicts better for you. Because we actually want to know that the people we're interested in are those who do not do well in the test, who are likely to struggle. So if the test classifies these students better, it means there's a chance that we will not be able to identify students who actually need help in terms of bridging the articulation gap. So what the results mean is that there is an advantage and a disadvantage here for different groups of students. Right. Again, if you look at the area under the curve here, it's 0.054, smaller than it was in the case of the isiXhosa group. So there isn't really that difference between the Afrikaans and the English group in terms of separating them out. But the test does classify, predict better for students from an English background. Now let's look at what these results mean. In the first place, the proficient band, which was the predictor variable in this study, had lowest sensitivity for the isiXhosa group, higher for the Afrikaans group, and the highest for the English group. So in other words, this group of students were actually advantaged in terms of being classified as those who would actually do well. And then the proficient band had higher specificity for the isiXhosa group, higher for the Afrikaans group, and then the lowest for the English group. Again, if you remember what specificity and sensitivity means, you should be able to interpret this. Now the proficient band was had the best classification rate for the English, and the better for the Afrikaans group, and the lowest for the isiXhosa one. Now the question is, are these students not disadvantaged in terms of how this test is able to predict success for them? Right. Now lastly, the proficient band had the best discrimination rate for the isiXhosa group, and it was better for Afrikaans group and the lowest for the English group. So in other words, for these two groups of students, it wasn't really that good in terms of separating them out, but it was for the isiXhosa group. So again, the sample size there was really small, and it's very difficult to really conclude on this, on the basis of this. Again, remember what I said about the area under the curve. This is a measure of the ability to discriminate between the two distributions of the scores, of the P pass population, the F population. So larger values of AUC indicate a greater discrimination ability. What do these results mean? It means that there's a validity issue here. Remember I said that traditionally validity means a test's ability to measure what it purports to measure. Now this is a criterion reference test, and the criterion that underpins it is academic performance. In other words, when the people at UCT came up with this test, their aim was to assess students' ability to make it at university. So there's no way for you to validate it unless you want to establish the relationship between performance and at university, or academic performance and performance in the test. So there's a validity and fairness issue here, because we take decisions. I spoke about selection decisions and then placement decisions on the basis of this test. Now, if it does not do things the same way for different groups of students, there's a fairness issue here. And we need to know about that. Again, the aim is not to criticize the test, but we need to know the extent of the error in this test, because we need to consider that when we make decisions about students. And this is something that policymakers dealing with admissions should actually consider. Now, this is particularly the case considering the scale at which South African universities use the NBT test without any awareness of this, because you're not going to get this kind of research coming from UCT, the developers of the test. Thank you.
Shall I hand the microphone around for comments for you to participate? I'm happy to do that. While we're having this, just please remember to sign the register. We'd like to know who came and who can probably come again. And then complete our feedback form also. All right, questions? I'll start here and then I'll pass it to you.
No, register first.
I'll bring you the register.
Okay, I'm Laura Kisner from Information Governance. Is it fine? I just want to know, the students can opt to write the test in Afrikaans or in English. Did you look at just the English test only, or did you use a combination of the Afrikaans and test AL? Because I would want to know whether there was actually a difference between how the Afrikaans students did in the Afrikaans, if they've written the test in Afrikaans, versus when they've written the test in English.
This is for the English test only, but the students who come from an Afrikaans background are those who they chose to write it in English.
Is it okay? So this is only for the English.
This is, yeah.
And you didn't look at how students performed in the Afrikaans version of the test?
No, I did not.
Okay.
I was very hesitant to do that because the test is translated into Afrikaans, so they don't, a lot gets lost in translation. So I was interested in this one in particular.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, excellent. More comments?
I'm a teacher. I don't know. It's for the recording. Oh, is it for the recording? Apologies. Kabelo, as you know, I've been working in the second language field at the university for the last few years, and my findings on the ground correlate 100% with what I've seen on your presentation today. Absolutely, if I had to guess, it would have been very, very close to those figures.
Kabelo, we looked at the test and how unfair it advantages or disadvantages certain students. My question to you is there a possibility that we can look at a test, or you can develop a test that will be fair across the board for all students, or would every group of students need to write a different type of test?
Can I just say that in 2018, I published a paper in which I did a study, but the data was from CUT, a University of Technology. But in that case, I was focusing on the TOL test, and I looked at how differentiated or not it predicted for students from high school, home language English background, or first additional language background. Now, I did that because most of the students who take English as first additional language at high school come from socio-economic backgrounds, most of them. So I had that in mind. So what I did was to look at whether the test predicted differently for students from those backgrounds. And what I found interesting was that the test the difference was not significant, and in fact, it favored slightly those who, in terms of prediction, those who come from a first additional language background than it did for those who come from a home language background, which was a very important finding because those are the students that we need to identify. We need to identify, and this happened regardless of whether these, those who come from an English home language background performed better. In terms of mean scores, those who come from an English background, high school background, performed better than those who come from a first additional language background. But in terms of prediction, the test predicted better for those who needed assistance or support than it did for the other group. So that was a different kind of test. So it is, so my answer would be that it is possible. At least I have been able to show that with regard to TOR, but again, I don't know what the result would look like for Stellenbosch University. This was for students at a University of Technology. But again, as you know, language use is determined by context, and obviously the disciplinary contexts are different. The challenge we're facing in this country is to come up with the kind of tests that would be context specific, as we are trying to respond to students' language needs in that specific way. It's a challenge that we have not been able to deal with so far.
Best the mic, just pass it on to the person behind you. Thank you.
Kabelo, thank you very much. I think it's most insightful, your analysis. And I think my concern is, because I'm very involved with our selection of students and these sort of things, you're looking at one metric, academic literacy, which I think we all agree is very important. But there's other metrics, even in the NBT, that are also important. So is the assumption that the other metrics are averaged out over the population, so you can look at only the impact of one metric, or that they are independent? Because academic literacy, just like NBT, mathematical literacy and engineering would also be a very important metric. So is the assumption that in the population those other metrics are not correlated with academic literacy? I'm just trying to understand, looking at one metric, looking at a success metric which includes a lot of other factors as well. How does that affect the validity of the test?
I get your point, Prof. The thing is that I focus on this one component of the battle of tests because of my language teaching background, and that does not suggest that others are not important. I have been thinking about looking at other components, but obviously if I were to write a paper, for example, I would need to describe what these other components do, and I'm very limited in terms of expertise. But I would be interested to know whether there's any difference. So, for example, students who come to engineering, for example, to what extent does math or language ability is measured in this test? To what extent do they contribute to their combined or separately or so? But the reason why I focused on this, just to answer the question, is that of my professional background, and I'm not suggesting that others are not important. Obviously, math would do better than academic literacy for students in engineering. Would better?
It does.
It does.
Oh.
I know that they do both do very poorly.
I know, we've had this discussion. I have met Professor Besson where he had done his analysis of this kind of predictive study in his own way for the students in engineering, and then I had done mine and I went to meet him and our results were the same. This test contributes, should I say marginally? Not really. Its contribution to success in the students in engineering is non-existent. It's very, I'm looking for this English word. But again,
Questionable.
Not questionable. It's not marginal, it's not, there's a word. Minimal. It's very, it is the smallest actually if you compare it. Negligible, that's the word I'm looking for. Now, interestingly, what I found is that this test itself actually contributes, is very predictive. Well, not very, but better predictive for students in the health and science medicine faculty, for example. And that was very interesting because those students come from the same school background in terms of subjects. So, yeah, we need to, this test does not measure everything. So it is possible that there's something language related that students in engineering need, which is not covered in the test, and we still need to investigate what that is. And then, sorry, Professor Basson, and what about quantitative literacy? What about quantitative literacy? You said maths does not.
Yeah, all three of the NBT scores,
All of them.
they R-squared correlation. We do, it's statistically insignificant correlation between first year performance and R-squares of 20%.
Okay, thanks. Good to know that.
I'm Nompilo from the Center for Learning Technologies. This was a very insightful presentation. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. My interest is in the technology you use or the software you use for your analysis. You mentioned that it actually groups differently depending on how many are in the population. I just wanted to know what software it is that you use.
Well, for this one, I have to admit that I had to ask somebody to do this analysis for me because I couldn't. I use SPSS, which is very user-friendly. It's non-technical. But the guy who used, they used SAS package, statistical package, SAS. Yeah, but like I said, it takes numbers into account. That's what I know about it. And like I said, language research, we really don't have large sample sizes. In fact, I decided to go ahead and do this because at least we had 100 students falling within the proficient band. That is the requirement for this kind of, the minimum requirement for this kind of analysis.
Seeing that I have the mic, Kabelo, I think you expect my question. The Sorry, man. I can't help myself. The Language Center is a support environment. So my question would have to be about the proficient students. Although there are some of them who aren't okay with, for instance, in the science faculty, with 2 lessons a week of science and context, they should be okay language-wise. But now we're coming to the intermediate students. And the test actually prescribes them that one should have a 1-year bridging. And we do have that with the extended degree programs. So my question is, what should happen with those students? How can we support them adequately? Because the university is continuing to have, these students gain access in all kinds of different ways. They don't even write the NBTs always, especially the latecomers. They don't write these. How should we use that 1-year bridging? And how should we support them language-wise?
I think the important thing again is to establish whether there's any relationship between performance on this test and what students have to do in their course. That's the first thing. And if we find that there is that relationship, then I would say, and I found this study already, I have presented it elsewhere, where I showed that the NBT proficient and the intermediate students do not perform the same way at the end of their first year. So the proficient ones tend to do better. So the test actually is able to separate them out so well that you know that the intermediate one would need to be supported in some way. So yeah, but again, we have to be very careful. And this is, like I said, this is a criterion reference test. To what extent does this test, the content of the test or performance of the test, relate to what your curriculum in your specific context? Because we cannot assume it is related until we decide. And this is exactly what Professor Basson and I did. We wanted to see whether it matters for students in engineering. We found it did not. But it does in other cases, actually. And a lot more so for students in the Faculty of Health and Science. Does it answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Engineers that need to count, but they need to talk.
But that is true, but also when I had this discussion with you, we agreed that there's some kind of language need that they have, which is obviously, and I got that from you, which is obviously not covered by the test because there is no evidence that this test relates to, how they perform. So we need to investigate what that language, specific language ability is for us to respond to.
Okay, so if then maybe the last question, and then I want to wrap up because you may have commitments at 2:30.
Billy, I just want to ask, could you get hold of detail marks of the different domains, how they performed in their different domains, so that you could see if there was an actual difference in the specific domain that, for example, the English students performed better on the Afrikaans, that you can more pinpoint of where the differences are in the subdomains, yes.
What I did, unfortunately, it wasn't part of this presentation. What I did was so when you develop a test, you define, in language testing, you define the ability. So that's your construct, and then you have to break it down into specifications so that you can actually develop the test and know how much of what must go into the test. So the NBT has those subdomains which I don't have here. So for example, vocabulary in context is one of them, inferencing is one of them. So what I did was to do an analysis of how each of these, predicted success for students in different. So I did a linear regression of each one of them in relation to end of first year average performance as an outcome variable. And the picture was different for different faculties. But I did this over 3 years, so 2017, 18, 19, no, 2016, 17, and 18. In the faculty of EMS, for example, the picture looks different in different years, but there's a reason for that. The students are not the same when they come here. Also the test, we don't know whether the tests are equated, because they don't use the same test all the time. That's another thing. Yeah, but what I found, for example, was that inferencing as a subcomponent of academic literacy assessment in NBT, for 3 years it was the most important for students in EMS as a faculty. And I kept that analysis I could share with you. But in the other case, in the case of law, for example, the picture differed over the 3 years. And so what I did now, and that is part of my project for the Scholarship of Educational Leadership, is to interview people in faculties to triangulate what I found quantitatively through qualitative research. And so I'm focusing on law and EMS now, and I'm hoping to do that for the whole university as a way, really, to get the language center to respond in an informed way in the future. Not that it's not responding in an informed way now. I'm just saying. So I have done that. I know that you said you asked me to share that analysis with you when you gave me the data. I will do that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, Kabelo. Certainly you stimulated a lot of thoughts. And I again realized when we use tests for predictive purposes, number one, use it to the advantage of the students, and be careful that even if you admit a student based on these tests, that we put in sufficient support specifically for those non-English home language speakers. That's my take on it. I thank you for your participation, for the questions. Obviously, many of you are grappling with how can we use a method like this to support our students and to guide them towards success. So I thank you all. Have a good afternoon, and we'll see you next quarter sometime for a similar seminar. Thank you very much.